All right, y'all. Can everybody see reconstructing East Baltimore's reservation?
Yes, we can.
All right. Um, Being a visual artist, I'm going to show you so many pictures while I talk. So, the place that is today known as Baltimore is part of the ancestral home of the Piscataway people who are alive and well, mostly in southern Maryland. And I hope by now everybody knows about this amazing resource, nativeland.ca. This is a screenshot from several years ago. Nativeland.ca, at this point, I think you can look up anywhere in the world and see community source knowledge about whose indigenous land is being occupied at any given location, what treaties affect that land, what languages were traditionally spoken there, and up until recently, if you looked up anywhere in the entire state of Maryland, it would come up Piscataway. But the truth is more nuanced, and as a nod to the importance of archival research, a few years ago, a colleague at Johns Hopkins University tapped the Maryland State Archives to bring forth this treaty document, which shows that the Susquehannock Nation actually ceded what would become the place that would become Baltimore to the colony of Maryland in 1652. And also more native peoples and nations have passed through and lived in the place today known as Baltimore since time immemorial. We're talking about 11 or 12,000 years prior to the arrival of John Smith, which is where most Maryland history textbooks begin. So there's a lot of indigenous history in the place today known as Baltimore that gets glossed over. It may surprise you to learn that the majority of American Indian folks who live in the Baltimore region today are not indigenous to Maryland at all. They're members of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. We descend, like myself, we descend from ancestors who come from a pretty wide swath of territory, as far north as the James River in Virginia and as far south as the Great Peedie in South Carolina. And fleeing disease and colonial warfare and enslavement, we coalesced in a place that is today known as Robeson County, North Carolina, prior to the establishment of the United States, and formed a cohesive group. And this is what it looks like there. This is the Lumbee River. We take our name from our river, which winds its way through our tribal territory. It's very dark and murky and swampy, otherwise known as Drowning Creek. And what doesn't look like the river in the swamp looks a lot like this. This is a field of tobacco. I took this picture myself in my own lifetime. Today, if you go there, it's still a very rural and agricultural place, but you won't see as many tobacco fields, more like soybeans and other crops. In my mom's youth, this was still the main cash crop of the area, and this is a picture of her, my uncles, and my grandma when they were a farming family. In this time, many Lumbee families found themselves dispossessed of their tribal homeland through the Southern agricultural system, and they found themselves sharecropping, which, if you don't know, people who experienced it refer to it as another form of slavery. It's where your whole family works somebody else's land for very little or no return at the end of a season. And my mom doesn't like it when I show this picture because she says it makes it look like they were so poor they didn't have clothes, but they did have clothes. See, they had clothes and even a car sometimes. And they were just out in the field. It was summer, but they were poor. And also in this part of the world, in this time, it was the Jim Crow South, and here there was tri-racial segregation. Three separate school systems, one for black kids, one for white kids, one for Indian kids, three sections in the movie theaters. So kind of a tough place to be an American Indian person. Lore holds, and it is true, that Lumbee soldiers coming back from World War II, like my grandfather here, passed through major cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Detroit, and decided it would be easier working in somebody's factory than cropping tobacco in the tribal homeland where you're a second-class citizen. And so they started to move northward by the thousands, and literally thousands of Lumbee Indians descended on Baltimore, Maryland, which is 400 miles due north. And it was understood then as it is today to be a black and a white city. People weren't expecting a huge influx of Indians who didn't look anything like the Indians on TV and Bonanza and Gunsmoke, who had curly hair and very thick southern accents. And you can see in this photo by A. Aubrey Bodine that Baltimore looks a lot different than the river and the swamp and the tobacco field. Through research, I found that we did have a Lumbee person in the city prior to the turn of the 20th century, so not everybody came after World War II. This is Dr. Governor Worth Locklear, who was an 1893 graduate of Baltimore University Schools of Medicine. He left home trying to get his education, which he couldn't get in tribal territory. And it turns out that school was just a couple of blocks away from where most Lumbee Indians would settle, some 50 years later. And it also turns out he's a relative. He was my great grandfather's uncle by marriage. So this kind of proves what we know to be true about the way ethnic communities form in diaspora. It's like somebody checks it out and then they send for their cousins and kids and nieces and nephews, and then pretty soon you have a whole reservation, which is what this highlighted area is in East Baltimore, where thousands and thousands of Lumbee Indians settled in the mid 20th century. So the main drags are kind of East Baltimore Street and South Broadway. And this, if you're familiar with Baltimore, this is an area that bridges the neighborhoods of Upper Fells Point and Washington Hill. And the arrow there is pointing to a street that no longer exists, where my great grandfather was living when he passed away in 1948. So he was here early. Here's a shot of some Lumbee women at the corner of Baltimore and Broadway in the 1940s. You can see that they have their hair done, and nice clothes, and all the cars in the background. So Lumbee people coming to the city had access to a world of technology that simply didn't exist in the tribal homeland. At this time, many homes weren't even wired for electricity. To this day, Robeson County is mostly a dry county, and in Baltimore, we have a bar on every corner, or a church. And as it happens, the first organized effort of Lumbee Indian people in Baltimore City was to form a church. This has been the Indian church my whole life at 211 South Broadway. From the church grew the Baltimore American Indian Center, a block north, at 113 South Broadway. And this is where I spent a lot of time growing up and then working with young people and learning to be a community artist. And here I want to say that in my mom's youth, racial intermarriage was not only socially unacceptable, it was illegal. And if you wanted to be with someone who was not part of your same race or even your same tribe, you pretty much had to move away. So when Lumbee Indians moved 400 miles away, they intermarried with everybody. And like every ethnicity of East Baltimore, there's a Lumbee version of that. There are Polish Lumbees, Mexican Lumbees, Greek Lumbees, African American Lumbees, Afro-Cuban Lumbees, like every kind of Lumbee. So at this point, this generation of kids you see here who are now in their 20s, we're truly a multiracial, multi-ethnic community. And this is also true for my own generation. My mom is Lumbee, my dad's white, my husband's mom is Lumbee, his dad is African American. So in our lifetime, mine and those kids you saw there, we always had the church, the Indian Center, this daycare that the Indian Center used to have across the street, and stories of places that just live on in infamy, like the Volcano Bar, which used to be at the corner of Ann and Fairmont. But if you go to this corner, you won't see a bar anymore. You can't even see where a bar would have been. But they say it was so violent, it erupted every weekend, and it just lives on in story. So we know it exists, and it's still part of the conversation. And some of the most important work I did with the kids of my community was to walk around the neighborhood and remind us that we have a right to be there. We're part of something so much bigger than ourselves. We're part of a legacy. Because when you are what I'll call racially ambiguous, like I am, people ask you a lot of stupid questions like, what are you? And the society, the city has a way of convincing you that you don't deserve nice things or a good quality of life. So it's good to remind yourselves that you do, and you do have a right to be there and take up space sometime. And we realize that we are really following in the footsteps of those who came before us. See? So I started to formalize a very short walking tour of the community that included just those few sites that I mentioned from my own lifetime, the church, the Indian Center, the daycare, and I could like point over there and say where a bar used to be. And I started at the church. With me that day was one of my elders, Sister Linda Cox. who is probably the most enthusiastic member of South Broadway Baptist Church and still the chair of the board of directors of the Baltimore American Indian Center and the daughter of a founder of the American Indian Center. And because she has so much more institutional memory than I do, I said, Sister Linda, you should lead the tour and I'll just help with logistics. And she said, okay. But then she spent so much time talking about the church and inviting people to services and even singing. You can see she sings, and people were like coming from across the street to crash our tour. I was worried we weren't going to make it to the other 3 stops. And I said, Sister Linda, we should really get up to the Indian Center. You know, we're going to miss lunch. And she's like, yeah, you're right. Let's go. So we tried to make it 1 block north, and we didn't make it more than 10 feet. She stopped us in front of El Salvador restaurant and said, don't you want to tell these people about the Indian store that used to be here? And I said, what store? I can't tell them about a store because I don't know about it. And it turns out it was gone before my time. So I started to think, with anywhere from 2 to 7,000 Lumbee Indians in this tiny neighborhood, of course we would have had more than an Indian center, a church, and a couple of bars and a daycare. How could I find out what we used to have? So I convened our elders. I got really excited because I had found this 1969 map called the Lumbee Community in Baltimore. It was part of a federal study, a feasibility study for the Indian Education Program, which we did eventually get. And I got really excited because there are some sites that I didn't know about on the map. There's also racial and ethnic vernacular of the time that's not so cool today. And then also the top of the map is labeled Urban Renewal Area Vacant, which is a good clue about why the neighborhood looks so different since then. And I made a bunch of copies and I passed them out and I said, look, I found your reservation. And they were like, no, you didn't. This is all wrong. And I also passed out pens. I said, well, could you mark it up? Could you fix it and change what's wrong or add what's missing? And they said, no, this is so wrong. We'll just turn it over and make our own maps. And that's what they did. So here's my Antoinette leading conversation, and they went alley by alley, block by block, street by street, and reconstructed the reservation of their youth. And you could just see the difference in volume of information, this map from the other. However, if every square on this map was supposed to represent a city block, it's a little hard to tell where things would have been, which is what I told them. And they said, well, what you should have done is you should have made us a big street map that we could have marked up together, which is what we did next time. And here my Aunt Jeanette is pointing to where she lived when she first came to Baltimore. But I still wasn't understanding what she wanted me to see. Having visited this neighborhood my whole life, I just wasn't able to make the connection between what she was pointing to and what I know from being there. So I said, I'm not going to get it until we all just go to the neighborhood and you point at what I'm supposed to be seeing. And they were like, okay. So I went out first with Sister Linda, and here she is pointing to a place where American Indian people have literally inscribed themselves into the landscape. This is a brick on Broadway Pier in honor of 2 founders of the Baltimore American Indian Center, her mother Elizabeth Locklear and Herbert Locklear, no relation. And then here's Aunt Jeanette, who we're riding along, and she tells me to pull over in a place where I'm not expecting to pull over. And we get out, and she says, this is where I lived when I first came to Baltimore. And I'm looking around, she's pointing into a park. And I say, Aunt Jeanette, you used to live in the park? And she said, no, all of this used to be apartment housing. So then it was at this point that I realized, and this is a Google aerial view of the neighborhood, that almost every place that Lumbees owned or occupied in this time is now completely unrecognizable due to urban renewal and just the transformation that's been ongoing in the neighborhood since. And that park that Aunt Jeanette was pointing up into is the north side of the 1700 block of East Baltimore Street, which used to be the heart of the reservation. And so I go into the archives trying to find evidence that what all these elders are telling me existed really did. Not that I don't believe them, but I want documentation. I want something to verify, to show the world that we had what we had. So surprisingly, I found us everywhere. This is from the vertical files at our library system downtown, the Enoch Pratt, slides of the Indian Center and the Baltimore City Archives. Sanborn fire insurance maps were hugely helpful. They show their hand collaged maps that show how neighborhoods change through time. And most excitingly, I found pictures of our heroes in the periodical archives, like here is Sister Linda's mother, Miss Elizabeth Locklear, from around the time the Indian Center first opened. My husband's grandma in the first folder of unprocessed photos I opened at the News American Archives. And I never met this lady, I just know her name. So I'm like taking pictures with my cell phone and texting my husband, "Is this your grandma?" And he's like, "Yeah." And usually the people in the archives, their families don't know they're there, or they themselves don't know they're there, or they've passed away years ago. And in a way, getting these images out is like repatriating them to our people. The Indian Center, when it was a much more busy place, the Indian Education Program when it first started. A very important find, the Citizens for Washington Hill, led by Miss Betty Hyatt at the front in the loafers and the trench coat on the left, who was a Ukrainian American activist. It turns out the city was going to raise the entire neighborhood, and what we have left today is as a result of her organizing and the convening of this diverse group of citizens, which also includes a Lumbee Indian and co-founder of the Indian Center in the middle, Miss Rosie Hunt, with her glasses on. So remember, it was Betty Hyatt Park that Antoinette was pointing up into, named for Betty Hyatt. So I started to understand more through archival research the different ethnic communities who have occupied the neighborhood through time, and how neighborhoods really are just they're always changing, like they're alive. And traces of everybody who's ever lived there or occupied that place are still around. You just have to know what to look for. So our church, that's been an Indian church my whole life, was actually founded as a Mariners church. It's pretty close to the water. Finished in 1848. It's the oldest church in the neighborhood. In the back of the church, here's a picture from the News American Archives of two Lumbee women getting ready to fry fish when they were doing Indian Center stuff back there. The Indian Center building was built to be a very fancy private home for a sea captain, Jacob Hugg, who was on the original Baltimore Harbor Commission. Later, it was owned by a Russian Jewish family. Later still, it was owned by the Catholic Church, and it was a home for Polish children before it became the Indian Center. That bar, the Volcano at the corner of Ann and Fairmont, the only picture I ever found of it was in the Afro-American newspaper, and this is a photo of a black man who was beat up at the Volcano. If you notice the date, this is during the original Baltimore racial uprising following the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But if you know about the Volcano, you didn't actually have to go there during an uprising to get beat up. You could go any regular day. And I found a picture of the bouncer, Clyde Oxendine, a Lumbee man. And oral history is also a big part of my research. So I was able to talk to two retired Baltimore City police officers who said even they didn't like to go in the Volcano. And when they get a call, they just kind of go there and stop in the street. This guy would be in the doorway saying, "I got it." And they'd be like, "Okay, you have it." The intertribal eat in carry out, which is in the unit block of South Broadway through the 1990s, so in my lifetime, is today Tacos Jalisco, and this neighborhood is more closely associated with the Latina community today. Photos from the Department of Planning that exist ironically as a result of urban renewal. They took pictures of all the buildings they knocked down before they knocked them down, like East Baltimore Church of God, when it was on East Baltimore Street. Here's the congregation. The Moonlight Restaurant, a Greek-owned diner at the corner of Baltimore and Broadway, which was hugely important to the development of our community and one of the first places where many Lumbee Indians coming from the Jim Crow South could go in and sit down and eat. It was one of those places where you could get a cup of coffee and nobody would bother you for hours. So a lot of the planning for the churches and the Indian Center took place right here in the Moonlight. Today it's a house. You can see they still have the mailbox. Our daycare / senior citizen center was a blood bank. It's creepy. Now it's a drug rehab facility, and on the rare occasion that I do lead a walking tour, people will come to the door and see us and they'll be like, "Oh, it's her again." Hartman's Barbecue on the left used to be in that building. Later, you can see these two buildings were merged into a church, and then it was a vacant church. And this was an important realization for me, that this building, which was recently renovated, was added to the urban renewal plan. So these things, like the very same one, it's just ongoing, like it keeps going. And now a lot of luxury apartments are popping up in the neighborhood. One of the oldest public housing projects right across the street from the Indian Center was recently demolished. Supposedly, it will be mixed income housing to take its place. We'll see. Okay, so very quickly, two stories why this work matters. This is the McKim Center. It's up on East Baltimore Street, closer to downtown. It was built to be a school, then it became a community center built by Quakers who were contemporaries of Johns Hopkins and Enoch Pratt, the people. In the 1950s, they were hosting sock hops because it was the dawn of rock and roll, like youth social dances. One fateful night in 1957, a photographer from Ebony magazine visited because they were working on this article, Baltimore's Mystery People. Mystery people of Baltimore, neither red nor white nor black, strange Indian tribe lives in a world of its own. And when I was doing my research, somebody brought me a copy of this article, and the headline wasn't the first thing that caught my attention. It was the fact that on the right, with her hand on her hip, unmistakably, is my Aunt Jeanette. There she is. And I called her up and I said, Aunt Jeanette, do you know you're in Ebony magazine? And she said, yeah, somebody saw me at the dance. I was just visiting Baltimore when I was 14 years old, and they took my picture and didn't say what it was for. Then after I got back to North Carolina, they brought me the magazine, and it just really kind of hurt my feelings because it says we don't know who we are, but I know who I am. And I was like, okay, Aunt Jeanette, I get it. But also look at these great pictures. Like, these are the images we have of Lumbee young people enjoying themselves on the landscape in this time. People didn't have iPhones. What a treasure. And I was able to find the magazine itself, and I brought it home to Aunt Jeanette, who just turned 80, and you can see how upset she is about it now. She was more thrilled to see herself and her peers. And because she told me it was at the McKim Center, and this was right before the pandemic, we could still go there. I was like, Aunt Jeanette, let's go to the McKim Center. And let me tell you about Aunt Jeanette. She gets frustrated with me sometimes because I ask her about everything. And she says she can't remember things that happened 60, 70 years ago sometimes. And I'm like, yes, you can. So we go to the McKim Center. Here she is on her way in. And suddenly she remembers where she was standing, who she was with, what music she was listening to even. And why is that? It's because our stories are embedded in these places, but they're also embodied by us. And when you reunite the two, all this heritage gets reactivated. One more quick story. My friend posted this picture of her mom in tribute on Facebook. Her mom died like 30 years ago. And I said, hey, Tammy, that's a beautiful picture of your mom. I think I recognize that headband from one of the photos of the News American Archive. Is this the same one? And she said, yes, it is the same one. And that's me. And please, are there any more photos from that day? And I said, well, there's a couple more, but I don't think it's anything you want to see. And she said, no, please let me see. And it turns out this is the one Tammy was really interested in. That's her in the back dancing with the headband on. And in front of her is her mom dancing. And she said her mom didn't dance very often, but she did that day. And she just really wanted to see her mom's dancing feet again. So we were able to repatriate her mom's dancing feet. This work started to get a lot of press. I was even able to write some about the work and get it published, which is really cool. So it's very Googleable. This one was co-authored with a colleague from Philly, Jessica Locklear, who writes about the Lumbee community there. And then in 2021, we released this print illustrated guide to East Baltimore's reservation. A whole team of artists work with me on this. Also, BaltimoreReservation.com. I think we have like 60 some sites at this point. You can see sources, you can tour the neighborhood without ever going there. I collaborated with Dr. Elizabeth Rule, who is a Chickasaw citizen, on the Guide to Indigenous Baltimore cell phone app, which is available for free download on Android and Apple platforms. And then most recently, we released Safety in Numbers, Portraits of East Baltimore's Reservation, which was a collaboration with two other members of our community in Baltimore. One's a construction worker, one is a social worker turned librarian, in celebration of just the people we found in the archives, because Most of the resources we released in 2021 were focused on the built environment. So if you want to see more, BaltimoreReservation.com, follow us on Instagram at Baltimore Reservation, and thank you very much.